16 years ago now, in Galina Andreevna Beloya's Predbannik. Sorry, Predbannik, you know, that's probably an ante-room or waiting room, but I don't think either of these two capture the full depth and spirituality of the Russian word. You know, so Galina Andreevna Beloya was the dean of the historical philological faculty at the Russian State University for the Humanities. So in her Predbannik, you know, I met three other students who were just like me waiting for Galina Beloya's appearance. And one was Marijeta, and little did I know that this meeting with her would be the beginning of a beautiful friendship that's, you know, lasted through graduate school and now through teaching. And Galina Andreevna, you know, who was quite a figure in her own right, you know, she's a major scholar of 20th century Russian literature. She was, you know, because she sadly passed away in 2005. You know, a semi-dissident of sort. You know, Galina Andreevna Beloya, upon, you know, as I was preparing to exit, asked me, so, молодой человек, what are you planning to do after you leave us? And I, you know, very shyly said, well, I'm probably going to apply to PhD programs in the States. Her answer still, you know, resounds in my ears. Не советую, там только, наверное, 5 человек разбираются в русской литературе. Had Galina Andreevna lived now, she would have probably corrected this number to 6, because I think Marijeta has joined her ranks, and it's really been my lasting regret that I never, you know, out of shyness, I never got to ask her who the 5 were. Yes, but really, Marijeta would have definitely been the 6th in the 7 years after she graduated from the Columbia PhD program in Slavic. She has written a book, you know, very highly regarded book on Nabokov's canon from Onegin to Ada. And he has edited 2 more, Nabokov Upside Down with Brian Boyd and Watersheds, Poetics and Politics of the Danube River. But besides, you know, being somebody who would have satisfied Galina Andreevna's criteria for understanding Russian literature, she's also someone who has pioneered the field in different ways, you know, putting Danube studies on the map, on the scholarly map, and also being on the forefront of digital humanities in our field. Lately, she has been working on avant-gardes, both historical but even more so contemporary, and that's going to be the subject of her new book and the topic of the presentation she'll have today. You know, a number of us in this room know her and can give various other introductions. Anne, who taught Marijeta as an undergraduate at the History and Literature department, would have given another one. And even if Marijeta hasn't been a student or faculty at NYU, I really think she's coming home now, so welcome.
The problem with Rosin's introductions is that one can only fail to live up to them once it begins on that note. I am so delighted to be here to see the new, growing, transformed NYU Slavic, etc. community. And I'm excited to talk to you about this project, which has been central to my imagination for a while now. And I will launch right in. What can politically engaged productions, aesthetic productions from the former Soviet Union tell us about socialism? As recently as 10, certainly 15 years ago, popular audiences and scholars alike might have answered this question by invoking the dissidents who fled the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Throughout the 20th century, dissidents provided popular and critical Western discourses with vivid and useful tales of both the treachery of leftist utopianism and the courage of individual resistance to it. Today, the ideologies that undergird this approach have become more readily apparent than ever, while a vital strand of post-socialist leftism has surfaced once more across the former Second World. And I'll put up this image and say that the former Second World has never needed Marxist critique more. As Stephen Crowley has suggested, writing in 2015, the central irony underlying contemporary Russian socioeconomic structures and their systematic study is that Russian society requires class-based analysis more than ever in the wake of its official discrediting. The rapid transfer of property into private hands that took place in Russia in the wake of the disintegration remains virtually unrivaled even in Eastern Europe. And I quote Crowley here, according to the World Bank, starting from a position of relative equality, Russia's increase in its Gini inequality index of 11 percentage points over a decade is close to a record. This concentration of property and wealth took place not during a period of economic growth, but one of dramatic decline, significantly worse than the US experience of the Great Depression. One study of Russian social mobility, comparing class origins with class destinations, found that from 1990 to 1998, downward mobility exceeded upward mobility by 30%, and that a downward shift, let alone of that magnitude, is highly unusual among mature economies. By one estimate, the number of poor in Russia increased from 2.2 million in 1987-1988 to 66 million by 1993-1995. And a year after the 1998 crisis, 4 out of every 10 people slipped into poverty, unable to meet nutritional and other basic needs. Yet the taboo topic of socioeconomic class remains under-examined by Russian social scientists and mainstream political rhetoric alike. With the revealing exception of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, there have been no successful, larger-scale political parties challenging United Russia from the left of the spectrum. Excluding decidedly anti-Marxist studies of the stabilizing potential of a near-mythical Russian middle class, or research declaring Russian exceptionalism to observe global economic patterns, theory has lagged behind the horrors of lived experience. The notable exception, and here's what this has to do with poetry, has been the rise of politically and socially conscious themes in popular culture as well as other aesthetic productions. In essence, the intellectual work of rebuilding class-based critique has emerged more prominently in the arts than in political theory, with a peak of sorts in 2012, the long year of Russian and international protest. So I aim to explore one such peculiar arena of social critique with this project, and to bring a generation and a half of Russian poets to critical attention. Some you may be more familiar with than others, but going from top left, Alexander Skidan, Dmitry Galenko, Katie Chukrov, Kirill Medvedev, Roman Sminkin, Pavel Arseniev, and Galina Rimbu are my case studies. These poets are frequent collaborators, linked by way of the journal Translit, several chapbook series, the Free Marxist Press, and a number of poetry festivals, events, and actions in Russia and abroad. Moreover, they are united by their overt political engagement and explicitly Marxist orientation. About half the group are active members of the Russian Socialist Movement political party. They thus occupy a peculiar and still fraught position in post-socialist, post-institutional socialist space and time. And I aim to explore what I conceptualize as a contemporary avant-garde, hence the paradoxical use of prefixes in my title, which gestures at the temporal paradoxes of a revived futurism. Here's an image of Skidan against a black square at an event. My thesis is that contemporary Russian poets seek in the legacies of the historical Russian avant-gardes of the 1910s and 1920s an undetonated alternative to both the neoliberal global present and to the still relatively recently discredited institutionalized left. I read the latest return of the Russian avant-garde as drawing on powerful local literary counter-traditions, reimagined through, reinvigorated by, and in solidarity with international theories and art practices. or to rephrase, post-Soviet praxes that take inspiration from and claim continuity with historical avant-gardes are dialectically influenced by international critical theory, all of it stitched through with a common red thread. Through embodied poetic performances, at protests that merge very agilely with digital remediation and dissemination, as through the prodigious translation of poetry, critical theory, and political philosophy from around the globe, the newest Russian avant-garde creates distinct combinations of the local and the transnational. As an explicitly post-Soviet cultural formation, this constellation of sympathetic practices dares to move past recent and current traumas to reimagine politically engaged art for the 21st century. Tracing a recurrent pulse of the avant-garde suggests an alternative narrative of 20th century Russian culture and shifts the discussion of contemporary aesthetic productions from narratives of transition and catching up to renewed experiment and dreams of futurity. Through the study, translation, modification, and reappropriation of the still incendiary texts and strategies of Russian avant-gardes, post-war European radicals, Guy Debord, for example, the Situationists, as well as global contemporary artists, thinkers, and activists, these poets create agile models of potentially emancipatory collectivities. Russian poetry merges with other forms, media, and languages through digital remediation, collective translation, and immediate dissemination via online platforms. And I'm showing a few images from the Translit blog that speak to this point. Meanwhile, efforts to think leftwards beyond state socialism the state socialist path to a global egalitarian future challenge both Russian and oppositional Western narratives in our increasingly interconnected world. I also argue that this avant-garde return cannot be dismissed as mere Soviet nostalgia. The highly aware cultural appropriations and remediations at play here can more readily be seen as a reaction to mainstream and official nostalgia for the imperial and militant aestheticized politics of the Soviet Union, for example, the Putin regime's ready embrace of the cult of World War II. Instead, these reimaginings and renewed engagement with historical Russian and Soviet avant-gardes, along with French, German, Italian, East European, Mexican, American, and other international leftist art and theory, range from appropriative to critical. Any forward-looking renewal of avant-garde energies necessarily includes important correctives, not least along the lines of gender and sexuality. I study poetic practices ranging from what I term the poetics of refusal, when the critique of literary institutions makes further publication impossible and transubstantiates poetry into activism, to difficult philosophical poetry modeled after Arkady Dragomoshenko and inspired by his exchanges with Lynn Heginian and the American academic language school poets. I'm particularly interested in the sites of publication and performance and in the reemergence of the avant-garde journal as a venue, art object, collective cause, and social network. Really all of these things. But of course, today's avant-garde journal has an active presence both off and online. While poets test the limits of digital dissemination, they also embody their poetics in performances that insist on the physical presence of the poet, at times in dangerous or illegal circumstances. And I'll just give a few examples of the variety of practices united by the Translit constellation. The first is by Pavel Arseniev, the young and impossibly energetic Diaghilev figure of the group. I apologize if the screen is tiny and the letters unreadable in the back row. I'll read it in Russian, and I'll put up Russian and English translation. So one of Arseniev's early manifesto poems reads, and here I'll put up the translation for at least the first two rows. Продается у Mayakovsky на новой торговой площадке Рунета. Рекламные ссылки добавит, послать ссылку другу, найдутся все. Неограниченный трафик, чем заняться в свободное время, картинки, еще. As is typical of Arseniev's work, it is initially difficult to identify Mayakovsky for sale as much of anything, as either a poem or the textual component of a composite artwork. It has been presented as both. Mayakovsky for Sale was published as a poem in Translit, labeled from the cycle Ready Written in English. The corresponding video I'll show this image online, has been published online and performs or explains its composition. Screen captured video shows the narrator, really a cursor, presumably Arseniev, logging into his email account and running a word search for Mayakovsky. The cursor hovers over but quickly skips past an email exchange that comes up that mentions Mayakovsky. Now, if the viewer pauses, rewinds, replays the video several times, it's possible to read fragments of the email exchange, which is with a live journal blogger regarding Arseniev's ideas about leftist poetry. But the cursor, however, skips past all that and heads for the advertisements and miscellaneous textual effluvia hovering at the edges of the screen. While the cursor selects the words and phrases that make up the poem or poem in quotation marks, Arseniev's digitalized voice reads aloud the oddly evocative words. The video offers a glimpse into Arseniev's characteristic play across media, collaborative and performative playful poetics, and use of new technologies. The piece flows back and forth relatively smoothly from an individual to a collective creation. The poem is presented as by Arseniev as a single auteur. The video piece is by the Laboratory of Poetic Actions, a collaboration with Roman Sminkin and fellow poet Dina Gatina. Poem and art object coexist in offline and online formats, taking advantage in each case of the particular context of their framing. Arseniev's most famous line of poetry, however, is this appropriation. One of the most recognized slogans of the 2011 and 2012 protest movements that emblazoned across a banner became a multiply remediated image of protest. Вы нас даже не представляете. The phrase is a pun based on the two meanings of the verb представлять, to represent and to imagine, resulting in the twinned readings of the slogan, you don't even represent us, you can't even imagine us. The line, which was photographed and blazoned across a red banner and then reproduced in gallery format, became a stand-in for the wit and youthful energy of a certain segment of protest culture as a whole. The pun also borders tantalizingly on the conceptual. You don't represent us politically, you cannot even imagine us, but the words themselves fail to represent. However, this kind of Magritte-like game, this is not a pipe. The language game nevertheless means something very legible and tangible politically, pragmatically charged with its particular context. And I would say that this also is a characteristic turn. I'll give another example. Sminkin reading a poem on new laws inside of a circle of activists that gathered to protest the changing internet laws in the summer of 2013 in Petersburg. And again, I'll show you the Russian translation. Бывает, повстречаешь малолетку и сразу принимаешь строгий вид. Быстрее проходите мимо, детка, от вас половозрелостью фонит. А я законы новые читаю, и мне педофилию не пришьешь. Будь вы похожи прежде на Данаю, но возраст ваш несовершенен все ж. The performance transformed the energy of an otherwise listless crowd and made of the minor protest an event with legs, especially through the ongoing digital dissemination of photos and videos of various quality that were taken by spectators. Sminkin prefaced his reading with the apology that his poems were about the wrong laws, so not the internet laws, noting that even he, with his graphomaniacal production, could not write fast enough to keep pace with the changes in Russian legislation. So his piece spoke into the, at that time, still recent and then surprising laws targeting sexual deviancy, purportedly intended to protect the nation's youth from corrupting influences. The list of encounters Sminkin's lyric persona sternly avoids includes an underage girl, a skulking foreign agent, lesbians, and finally, in the last stanza, the untranslatable Baba, a Russian woman, is doomed to remain. And I cannot but read the last two stanzas. Бывает, повстречаешь лесбиянок и сразу принимаешь строгий вид. Будь трижды девицы без изъянов, от вас Гоморры за версту фонит. А я законы новые читаю, гей-пропагандою меня не прошибешь. В России пол себя не выбирают. Родилась бабой, бабой и помрешь. So, legitimizing and bond-forming performances like this one require the poet to be bodily present at protests, arrests, or other charged events. Meanwhile, the digital remediation and dissemination of these performances serves to document and share work with a wider community. In the new Poetics, these worlds, the online and offline, interact with and necessitate each other. Digital dissemination reflects the way that we actually read, share, and reference this material, whereas hard copies of the journal, for example, or chapbooks, provide physical support merely, serving the purposes of gathering groups together, fundraising, archiving, signing, personalizing, and gift-giving. And I'll give one last example much closer to home. In February of 2015, the exhibition Spectres of Communism, Contemporary Russian Art opened simultaneously in two New York locations, the James Gallery at the CUNY Graduate Center and eFlux. Curated by NYU's own Boris Groys, the show presented work by a collection of contemporary Russian cultural figures. Katie Chukhrov, the Что делать collective, Anton Vidokul of eFlux, and even Pussy Riot. Groys's introductory essay made clear the premise of his curatorial selection. Taking inspiration from Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, Groys chose works that suggest communism, and I quote him here, "Communism continues to haunt Russia as well as the West." The conceptual work suggested by that haunting, however, only goes so far, I would say arguably, for Groys or Derrida. Groys's conceit, with its characteristic emphasis on the transformation of life into art, suits some of the pieces. As reviewers, including NYU's own Anastasia Osipova, who was here earlier, noted, however, the most compelling work in the show looks forward as well as backward. The pieces by Katie Chukhrov in particular, and the collective Что делать, with which Chukhrov has collaborated many times, in particular grapple with the topic of the emergence of political subjectivity. I'm showing a few images from her standout piece, Chukhrov's standout piece for Spectres of Communism, which very much reads as a collective conjuring. The 2013 video Love Machines is based on Chukhrov's text, a verse drama structurally familiar to readers of her other poetic work. Chukhrov's classically trained voice is also heard in several unexpected bursts of song in the piece. But the video is shot and edited by others, Sergei Shilov and Viktor Olimpiev, respectively. The actors include other poets and artists well known in Russian leftist circles, so Dina Gatina again, Arseniy Zhelayev, the latter an artist who also had a piece featured in Groys's show, as well as the group Trupa Rupor and the artistic director Semyon Filipov. Love Machines then is hardly video art by Chukhrov, even though it is often presented that way in ephemeral materia. So much as a collaborative co-production based on her written work and made with her full participation. The content of the experimental verse drama, and I'll show another image from one particular version of it, is harder described, reading in many ways as an allegory that refuses entirely to signify its secondary meaning. The love machines in question are futuristic androids sent to intervene in, seduce and destroy, accelerate, maybe both, the meaningless lives of contemporary Muscovites. We view three stages of development, as it were, simultaneously: a cow, human, futurist machines, trapped together in a black box of some kind of shared destiny and collective responsibility. The human remainder, as much as it can be delineated and differentiated from the abused, loving animal on the one hand and brutal, seductive machine on the other, is hardly appealing. Yet the elite formation of futurist cyborgs who would eliminate all who cannot rise to their standards hardly maintain the moral high ground. The cyborgs' warm-up exercise, by the way, is "Dir Bolshil," Alexei Kruchonyk's most quoted line of the avant-garde assault on Russian poetry from 1912, and it registers as a mocking rebuke of one kind of avant-garde teleology. There's a tautological whiff here of Groys's own total art of Stalinism, which drew a direct and speedy line of descent from Russian revolutionary avant-garde energies to the terrors of high Stalinism, and which may explain Groys's attraction to the piece, and actually several times he has now curated shows and invited Chukhrov to participate. However, what Chukhrov explores across her complex and growing body of work ultimately reads neither as totalitarian fear-mongering, it is committedly Marxist, nor as Soviet nostalgia, it is profoundly critical of the failures of institutional socialism. So how then might we imagine an updated genealogy of the Russian poetic avant-garde or avant-gardes? Nearly all of my subjects recognize a precursor in the conceptualist Dmitry Prigov, who played the role of Russian poet as an extended provocative art performance, which on the one hand seems to make sense, but in fact is deeply strange. Prigov, in turn, has located his own experiments against the backdrop of the historical avant-gardes of the early 20th century. In Yevgeny Dobrinka's summary, discussing the genealogy of avant-garde art producing, Prigov distinguished its three ages: futurist constructivist, which was replaced by reaction against the mechanicalness and planned euphoria of the first, the aberuti, and only in the third age, pop art conceptualist, did the completion of the triad take place, the declaration of the untruthfulness of totalitarian ambitions. Building from this brief history of Sots art, we can add a fourth turn with the current generation of avant-garde poets and producers, the paradoxically post-Soviet avant-garde. But why is Prigov so important to this overtly politicized group of contemporary poets and activists? Prigov brought Russian poetry into the space of contemporary art, specifically into a space of conceptualism and performance. More a poet in quotation marks than a poet, Prigov was a performance artist playing great Russian poet, undermining the logocentric tendencies of Russian culture by taking it to an extreme. Slavoj Žižek has argued that over-identifying with an explicit power discourse, simply taking the power discourse at its public word, acting as if it really means what it explicitly says and promises, can be the most effective way of disturbing its smooth functioning. Anthropologist Alexei Yurchak, in somewhat similarly, defines late Soviet parody and styob. Through such actions as his infamous performance of Tatyana's letter from Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin, which is what I'm showing here, one of the most beloved moments in the classic repertoire of Russian literature, as a faux Buddhist mantra, of course offending absolutely everybody, Prigov disturbs the mystified function of the text that he is reading precisely by exposing it as sacred and through the audience's reaction. The graphomania of Prigov's enormous poetic output, estimated at around 36,000 poems, in turn disrupts a privileged mode of reading, of exegesis, the close reading of the text for its hidden worth and difficulty. Of course, the privileged romantic mode, but also united with the Soviet/dissident preoccupation with Aesopian language that could slip subversive meanings past censors. Through its very bulk, Prigov's oeuvre forces us into a kind of distant reading avant la lettre, a reading that moves rapidly across many poems in search of meta-narratives. The change in strategy opens up new and unexpected possibilities for subsequent generations. We might compare Dmitry Golinka's rejection of the romantic and neo-romantic mode as described in his manifesto essay, Applied Social Poetry. Golinka writes, "In order to give the poetic utterance an applied character, the poet with a radical gesture renounces the principle of aesthetic autonomy and also the use of the stereotypical romantic and modernist character of the poet-prophet, demon or eccentric. At the same time, he is compelled to free himself from the illusion of artistic independence and to admit his absolute dependence on antagonistic social codes and on a number of contradictory social voices." Now, Golinka's essay is in part inspired by the Polish artist Artur Żmijewski's manifesto, Applied Social Art. Żmijewski argues directly that art can be used for the most diverse political goals, as an instrument of receiving and disseminating knowledge, as a factory of cognitive procedures based on intuition and imagination, as an occasion for learning and for political action. Golinka extends these possible uses of art to poetry, or at least to certain kinds of poetic practice. The translation, as it were, from Polish to Russian, from art to poetry, leaves remainders and plenty of room for anxiety, not least about over the space of reception. A visual work of art, an installation or a performance has the advantage of physically gathering together an audience, and hence maintains at least a surface potential for interactivity and fluid relationships between the performer and audience, very different from the ways in which we typically consume poetry, or at least the way that we did in the 20th century. Arguably, we consume it now online in completely different formats. The younger generation of performing poets then tries to take strategic advantage of the space opened up by Prigov. In an interview with me in July of 2014, Kirill Medvedev suggested the following line of dissent. What was Priga's accomplishment in large part? In that he learned each time with a mass of the most diverse methods to confront the reader with that serious, that modernist approach to art, to the poetic subject, to language in general. That is, you begin reading Priga's work as verse, but then you understand it's impossible to read it that way, as verse, but as that frame of mind persists inside of you, it creates a conflict. And in that, it seems to me, it all rests. Each time some kind of neat creation of a unified subject falls apart. And it falls apart, namely, through an impulse from below, as it were, a kind of direct and immediate unpoetic discourse. And in that, it seems to me, Roma, he's referring to Roman Esminkin, has glimpsed some kind of potential for a new democratic approach in Priga's poetics. And he decided to develop it in a more engaged direction. For example, Esminkin uses a line from Priga as the epigraph to On the Method, an essay describing his own poetic practice. He writes, I think that the most democratic literature is not one that is comprehensible to everyone, but one that pays attention to all conventional linguistic gesture. In the context of Esminkin's prose and thought, the emphasis on democratic literature reads completely differently than in Prigov and implies concrete political goals. Such practices, however, as we see, repoliticize and even tentatively re-romanticize, albeit with accompanying irony, the figure of the poet. Medvedev speaks of a weak heroism necessary in a political moment when cultural figures feel called to social responsibility and even to heroic action, while remaining deeply ambivalent about and profoundly suspicious of the heroic posturing of the Russian poet. This image, for example, depicts Medvedev with other members of his group, Arkady Kots, singing Stanley, Louis Locke's 1968 Catalan protest song Listasa, remade into Muri, the anthem of Polish solidarity in the 1980s, now in Medvedev's Russian translation. Of course, they're singing inside an Avtozak police van when they were arrested while protesting outside of the courtroom during the Pussy Riot trial. Clearly recording and disseminating this kind of impromptu music video, which is one of several versions available on YouTube still, suggests conscious political utilization of the recently dismantled cultural capital of the poet in Russian society. And here in a similar pairing from Esminkin of that period. The poet performing in support of the Pussy Riot, or in protest of the Pussy Riot trial, and then the filmed footage shows a mother dancing with a small child. The study of such forms, I would argue, also offers us an opportunity to reimagine and occupy a very different space in the Slavic literary studies field. In the place of Cold War dichotomies, we might foreground instead transnational Russian-American exchanges, political and cultural solidarities. The newest and most networked Russian avant-garde complicates our frameworks of study through the shock of synchrony between producing and consuming international publics. The canonization of Kirill Medvedev, for example, has been taking place in real time. In the past 5 years, international audiences began catching on to a voice that was familiar to Russian, to Moscow literary circles especially, since the early 2000s. For non-Russian readers, the breakthrough coincided with the first volume of his work in English translation, It's No Good, published in December of 2012 through the efforts of Keith Gesson and Matvey Yankelevich at the Brooklyn-based N+1 and Ugly Duckling Press. Medvedev's essays on politics and aesthetics have since made their way into such publications as the New Left Review, The Guardian, the London Review of Books. Interviews and reviews appeared in The Independent, The Nation, The New Inquiry, The Boston Review, The Chicago Review, The Paris Review, The Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, to name a few. In Bomb magazine, Chris Cumming points to the striking fact that a Marxist activist and free verse poet who writes only for his own blog at the time should get as much attention in America as Medvedev has, including a favorable review last week in that mouthpiece of socialism and experimental poetry, the New York Times. No doubt this reflects the tireless publicity work of his publisher, N+1, but there's more to it. Many people in America are disgusted by our politics and depressed by our literary culture, and Medvedev's central subject is the miserable marriage of these two. And his own life, even his Russianness, gives his opinions a legitimacy on these subjects that American writers lack. He has behind him a tradition of Russian artists who combine political and aesthetic radicalism, something American writers don't really have. That's Cummings speaking, and the problems with this exotic Russian authenticity are too close to the surface to need much pointing out, but perhaps better that than Russian hackers these days. My own methods of doing this kind of work range from textual analysis, so more familiar to some of us from our training, but also interviews, readings of cultural happenings, events based on years of recurring field work, and also hours of conversations, translations, and collaborations. I try to highlight the confusing collapse of some of these distinct approaches when working with contemporary material in a globally networked era. And I'll show a few images from Asminkin's Facebook posts. What degree of distance can be posited between Russian aesthetic practice and American academia today, given ongoing dialogues as well as constant fears, anxieties of tokenization or anachronism on both sides? Contemporary technologies enhance global communities' awareness of one another in dramatic and unprecedented ways, influencing aesthetic and critical practices. And I try to consider these paradoxes an integral part of my story. The sudden shock of synchrony between Russian and American intelligentsias is at once disenchanting and productive for both communities. The poets whose work I analyze, in turn, both suggest and push back against critical frames as they themselves study and translate and publish essays on Benjamin, Bloch, Debord, Deleuze, Pasolini, Rancière, Zizek, Masumi, and more recent theory alongside original poetry. So, in conclusion, what kind of avant-garde legacy is this? It is a pulse beating strongly or weakly throughout the last century and more, offering up a history of unrealized possibilities and interrupted projects. The poets of Translit read earlier Russian avant-garde through the lenses of decades of international Marxist theory, which is now part of the world culture that post-Soviet Russian writers can reclaim. And I'll show this image of Что делать, several of the poets have been speaking about, and the School of Engaged Art in St. Petersburg uniting around a performance that involved an image of the Black Square. Keith Gesson asks, in his writing on Medvedev, what was it that these newcomers see that the previous generation of Russian intellectuals failed to understand? And responds, the very thing they thought they knew best of all, Marxism. Not the Soviet teachings of Karl Marx, but the many intellectual errors of Marx in the West in the post-war era. This was the Frankfurt School and Sartre and the Situationist International and Pierre Bourdieu and the Anglo-American thinkers around the New Left Review, but also such thinkers, non-aligned thinkers as Barthes, Foucault, and Baudrillard. It's not that these figures were entirely unknown in the Soviet Union, but that they were only partly known or known in the wrong context. Medvedev corroborates that reading. Why doesn't Russia have a normal literary criticism, he asks in a more recent interview. Because all the major critical theories of the West in the 20th century passed in one way or another through Marxism. He says, until the same happens in Russia, there won't be any criticism at all, not of poetry, not of the authorities. And I'll end this presentation with a final quote from a recent interview with him. The goal of Russian art today must be to find new ways of interacting with politics, pushing off in part from the achievements of our 1920s avant-garde and in part from the experiences of the West in the 20th century, which was in many ways ignored or marginalized in the USSR. I don't believe that Russian history and culture have a specific messianic mission, but I do know that from time to time, the situation in Russia unfolds in such a way that it gives rise to a cultural political leap, allowing us to overtake the West and present something genuinely new, or else to give our very specific, but at the same time universal answer to a problem the West has been wrestling with. That's what happened with the political form of the Soviets that came out of the 1905 revolution and were later adopted by many revolutionary and social movements across the world. The same thing happened with the Russian avant-garde. It's possible that we're experiencing a similar situation right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marijeta. Well, now it's your turn.
Thank you so much for that stimulating talk. I have a question that actually, we had a talk on like an adjacent topic yesterday, so this has been like brewing in my brain since then. I was thinking about what you were saying about poetry as activism, and also the issue of political legibility? Because it seems natural that this group of poets is like partly coming out of the early Soviet avant-garde, but on the other hand, like as political activism, how does it work to adopt those types of stylistics which aren't generally legible? Like, is it possible to be aesthetically avant-garde and at the same time also be engaged in serious political activism? Like, how does that work for this group that you're looking at? How do they close the legibility gap, I guess?
It's an excellent question, and one of the, I would say, central recurring themes of the manuscript that I'm working on, and it varies really dramatically across practices. So I would say that, in essence, all of the 7 poets that I use as primary case studies, that I read as my primary case studies, are grappling with this question and try completely different approaches and responses. Ranging from, I would say, more abstract, relative autonomy of art to quite engaged. And again, also their practices change over time. I would put maybe on one clear extreme, Kirill Medvedev, who is constantly actively engaging in protest. Right, recently it was the pension reforms. I think just as of last week, it was a medical union that he was participating and organizing, but also performing at. And clear place of slippage for him, let's say, between more autonomous, detached practice and the more overtly engaged and activist, I would say, is between works written primarily as poetry and works primarily performed with a group Arkady Kots. In terms of an extreme version, let's say, of engagement, practical usability, the example that he gave me is an album that Arkady Kots was commissioned to make by independent labor union organizers, which he also always wields as his defense when people say, this is elite stuff, who needs this? Is aha, the labor organizers do, and they paid us to record this. But that is extremely different than the example that I give from Katie Chukrol, who is working in a more abstract space of intellectual engagement and, let's say, internal self-critique among a population of leftist intellectuals.
Can I comment on that? I think these guys actually are fairly accessible. I think this problem goes across the board, not just in Russia. And an extreme case of it in English is J.H. Prim, who, wants to be, thinks of himself as a Marxist poet, but is really, very hard to decipher without several PhDs, right? This is not, by contrast, right? Medvedev is kindergarten material, right? I don't say this in a bad sense, right? It's super accessible.
If I can make a comment on a comment, something that I thought about has dramatically changed in our reading and analytic practices is with Google searching, accessibility also changes.
Yeah.
So Alexander Skidan is filled with difficult and obscure allusions. You have to know the particular translation, Russian translation of Celan that he was reading in '85 to understand a particular turn in a poem, which would have been impossible for me 10 years ago. But now I'm like, wait a second, and I Google it and I'm like, aha, this is the particular translation of Celan that he's using. So there's something also genuinely unexpectedly democratizing about the Google search as used for poetic exegesis. I'm not entirely serious about that, but yeah.
But then the second thing is, from the point of view of old type poetry, is that what we see here is the same thing that we see in visual arts, which is the move away from traditional methods of representation. The work of poetry right now, of a poet right now, is not just about working with language, right, in this group. It's multimedia, and part of the multimedia is also its use of the body, right, from protests to performances, right? So in that sense, in traditional terms, it's almost exclusively Galinka and Rambu that can be read in traditional terms. Nobody else really can.
Yes.
I'm not from academia, so you can dismiss what I will say. What I would like to actually comment, if you were yesterday at the Khlebnikov event, yes, you probably understood that most the activism work of avant-garde poets started after revolution, not before revolution. Before revolution, it was very unpopular group, and they accept revolution partly because of this, because they want to be more popular and start to work for the social change. But before that, it was just an aesthetical movement, which was not very popular. Here is I'm not sure if there is clear what I would like to say. That the activism, actually also it's social change, and they assign themselves to a particular social change, but not really maybe represented.
I think I follow, and I think one thing that I would say in response, maybe in comment, that it has been very fascinating to me to watch changes over time. So certain of these poets were engaging in their aesthetic and political practices in the early noughts, and they were received and perceived in a very different way. Skidan, as part of Что делать, probably the first such group to declare themselves to be Marxist, post-Soviet Russian space, said that everyone thought they were crazy, quite simply. Very different perception, 2011, 2012, with the energy of the new Decembrists in Moscow, etc. And again, very different experience now, when there has been a shrinking together of this kind of community. And I would say, less optimism, more survival in one form or another.
I just am adding on to this thing an idea that possibly when people really need art, then they are open to it, and suddenly it becomes clear whether it's abstract or difficult, or they find out how to interpret it. And then when there are times when it seems like nobody wants art at all, and then they go to Pornhub or something. There's a sort of moving away from the arts, and there's also a moving towards the arts as something precious. And I think that plays into it too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When the times need the artist.
Right, cultural productions of various forms. I mean, I would also say that we are watching an incredible explosion of various kinds of cultural productions in Russia, in Eastern Europe, all over the place, of a reactionary postmodernism. And this is very much a kind of backdrop against which these voices are emerging and in dialogue with. This is something I try to invoke when I said, not Soviet nostalgia. There's a very different, a very anxious, a great deal of anxiety and distancing from an aestheticization of politics that leads in one militant direction. So many questions.
Sorry, I really don't know anything about contemporary Russian poetry, so thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. And I put a question that really shows how much I don't know anything about it. Do they have any problem with censorship? Online things, blogs and everything. Does government stop sometimes something, or they?
It varies. I would say that many of them have had all sorts of legal run-ins and are arrested constantly, but it's usual for direct action and not for protests. So let's see, Galina Rimbu was arrested in front of me twice in a 4-day period once, but it was for being one of the organizers for an LGBT-friendly action. Pavel Arsenyev was arrested for using profane language in a poetry reading. So. But again, less for the politics, but for
so online things that are on the internet, they don't touch.
They do, but political activism, direct political activism and engagement.
I had a question about gender. So some of your case studies, I assume, are focused on poets who are women, and I was wondering whether there is any productive conversation with our feminism of the Marxist vein going on there, because it feels that from the examples that we just heard even, and from the idea of how Ketone Additive, for instance, Kraft his image, it's an emphatically masculine, phallocentric idea of a poet. And then is there a different kind of voice for the women in the group?
I would say that gender and self-awareness about gender actually emerges across the group. I don't think there's a kind of clear reading of Medvedev's gender politics. Even someone like Skidan, who I would say more so seems to borrow from a certain kind of modernist posturing, questions it in his work. Galinka, maybe actually the most so, puts forth, implodes a poetic subject, but there's something revolting about the voyeuristic gaze that he explores over and over again. So I think regardless of the assumed biological gender of the poet, that there is a great deal of interest in that across the group. Galina Rimbu, perhaps most actively, does things with gender, playing with grammatical gender in Russian in her work. And I would say that Chukrov as well, maybe less clear in this particular piece that I showed, is very interested in, let's say, probing the feminist limitations of a certain leftist discourse and the other way around. A suspicion of an American academic feminist discourse that is based on different experiences, different assumptions than the post-Soviet subject.
Yes, so you mentioned that that these poets are mostly inspired by the 1920s avant-garde. I'm wondering if, or like 70s, if there is any influence from the 60s avant-garde poetry, because it seems like politically the moment now is more similar to like 1968 than to the revolution, because it doesn't seem like there is anything is going to change so radically.
Absolutely. I would say that the situation is international, and its many international heirs and legacies is one of the most frequently cited, referred to collective forms for these poets.
So are they influenced by like any specific poets from the 60s or artists from the 60s?
The foreign example that I was thinking about as being most dramatic is Debois, Guy Debois, and a kind of constant, playful, parodic engagement with Debois, Society of Spectacle in particular.
Hi, I'm going to stand up so you can see me. I'm Jillian Porter. Thank you for a great talk. I've learned a lot from it. I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about whether these poets you're studying really form part of a group. You mentioned that they collaborate with one another. At times you spoke of sort of the Translit poets, and then you mentioned, I think you said this was a picture of the School of Engaged Art in St. Petersburg. Is this a group in St. Petersburg? Is this a group with a few other people not in the group, or what is the structure of associations of these poets? And then, as a maybe related question, where did they get all this Marxism? It's interesting to think that if they're not studying it in school, right, how are they accessing? Is this just their independent reading, or are there a couple of these figures who are particularly well versed in this theory and they're talking about it amongst themselves, or what is the sort of core of their knowledge and engagement with the theory?
Excellent questions. For the first, I would say, partly I use the language of constellation, and this is maybe one of the reasons that I find the return to an avant-garde, and specifically the avant-garde journal and the uses of the avant-garde journal, to be so illuminating and useful. The poets are absolutely linked, and it's primarily, I would say, the journal Translit and then its various offshoots, socially, intellectually, that link them. There are many, many more poets and thinkers that publish in Translit, but what I've tried to do is identify figures that are central, so not only interesting for their own poetic practices, but that are central, let's say, hubs and nodes in a kind of network we might map of this group. And the various related groups are deeply, deeply interconnected. So someone like Katie Chukrov publishes in the journal Translit directly. She's also a faculty member at the Higher School of Economics now, and was one of the founding members of Что делать. Several others, including the philosopher Artyom Magun, high-up academic in this European University of St. Petersburg, Katie Chukrov, Igor Chubarov, and several others were united, came together as students of Podoroga, the Russian philosopher, which is deeply interesting to me. They seem to go in a very different direction than their master. But let's say there was a kind of a Moscow group of that sort. Then there was a group of poets around Arkady Dragomoshenko, who studied at his feet. Pavel Arseniev and Roman Sminkin literally met in Dragomoshenko's special home seminar. So a couple of these informal street university apartment kitchen instruction situations that brought people together, often at a very young age. Another example, a historian who's deeply connected with this group and works with Kirill Medvedev and has been here at NYU, Ilya Budraitskis. He, at 17, I think, was working with Osmolovsky in art performances. So certain figures, movements, primarily in St. Petersburg and Moscow that I'm discussing in this project, that then created a mini flood in their wake. And then those poets and figures interconnected and started forming new institutions, like the journal Translit, which serves to unite them, like the Free Marxist Press. But one of the many things that absolutely astonishes me about members of this group is their astonishing erudition. Occasionally it's very difficult to keep up with them in their theoretical reading because of the way that the flow of information actually works today. So some post-operaist work is published in Italy and is immediately pirated, translated into Russian, and released on the sly in Moscow 10 years before an English translation comes to American academic circles.
Sorry, probably it's not going to be the most comfortable question, but you're probably the best person to answer this. And this is about the constellation of power. And probably it's maybe at this stage more useful to discuss them as individualities rather than, as a collective whole. But, their orientation, the degree of their orientation towards Western theories, Western audiences, and how, and maybe it would be helpful to discuss the question individually as it pertains to different poets, and how you, as a scholar based in Western academia, tackle the I hesitate to call it pitfalls because it's probably at some level, useless to be hyper self-conscious about your interactions with the poets. But how do you, as a scholar coming from the West, relate to them? And because I imagine historically, as American Slavists, have been meeting their Russian peers and meeting Russian poets, for over 6 decades now. But it is so there's a long historical precedent. But it's still always very interesting how one deals with contemporary culture in a scholarly fashion and writes about it.
It's an extremely important question, and I would say several questions wrapped into one. Starting at the end, I just want to comment that, yes, American Slavists have been meeting their poetic subjects for decades, but I would argue that the rate of exchange, speed of exchange, and frequency of exchange is completely different. So I don't know if this is posted and then linked to online via social media. I can have a response from Katie Chukrov within 5 minutes of ending the lecture of, no, that's not what love machines means. We've talked about this. How can you continue to misinterpret my work, etc., etc. And this is in real time, and this I think is quite different and changes the experience. I want to pull two threads from your question, one having to do with orientation towards Western academia, because I think this is a dangerous one, and this is one that we have to talk about, because I'm sure many of us have noticed in our practice, in our teaching, that authentic Russianness or authentic, fill in the nationality S, is something that can be taken away from you if you cite too many foreign philosophers at times. This is something that I find highly problematic, something that I point out over and over again, let's say to graduate students reading a particular philosopher, look at all the footnotes, look who is being cited, this isn't really Russian thought, and then we discuss whether we respond the same way to a Canadian writer, whether we parse out how many Canadian writers they've referred to vis-a-vis American writers. Of course, there's a real fear there, but at the same time, what I'm analyzing in all its manifestations is an anti-nationalist phenomena. Deeply suspect of Russian authenticity and the fetish of Russian authenticity in its various forms. I would also want to emphasize, and in fact, underline 3 times, that it is not as if these are figures somehow invented by Western academics. These are all figures who have been published, recognized, legitimized by Russian cultural capital bestowing institutions such as NLO, such as the Andrei Biely Prize. So if anything, it's that Western academia follows these and then is like, aha, this is the person I should be writing about. And there is something important to be said there. The other really important thread is the ethics of academic exploitation and cultural imperialism in its various forms. Many of us who find ourselves at times uncomfortably in American Slavic studies departments worry about this a great deal. Even, let us say, the presumptions of critical distance that implicitly posit an objective us and an authentic, colorful them in certain kinds of practices, in certain deep, I want to say, Jamesonian readings for ideology. So on the intellectual level, I would say that the way that I try to read has more in common with Heather Love, close but not deep, or Sharon Marcus's surface reading, than a kind of ripping apart and exposing. Although there is something said to be the latter work. In terms of practical engagement, which is also extremely important, it's in fact something I worry about all the time, and I think that we need to worry about all the time, and that changes from context to context what I think is the correct, the ethical way of proceeding. I think in our moment what we can do is, whenever possible, when discussing the works of these poets, we can invite them. We can give them a space at the table, so not just as poets reading and then falling silent where others discuss their work, but invite them to join us on roundtables and discuss and debate back and forth. We can pay them, we can translate them, we can teach them, and we can also invite critical feedback, both from them, from, let's say, Russian academics, from each other, about the times that we fail, because of course we do fail and we exploit. But if anything, and this is maybe too optimistic and letting myself off the hook, that the practice of working with living writers makes that so sensitive and brings it to the surface that in a sense I consider myself fortunate. It's far easier to exploit the dead. Let's put it that way.
Can I say something about that also? I think right now we have a completely different situation than we did before the fall of the Soviet Union. The situation is in part formed by the fact that these poets travel, right? They're not indigenous people. They also travel academically, right? I mean, Galinka spent several years teaching in South Korea, after which he spent a year living in Berlin, and is currently trying to get out of Russia as hard as he can. Arseniev was doing a PhD at Lausanne. I think he finished. You have to file. And these people are also academically engaged in a Western way. Galinka, who's probably not the best example of engagement in this sense, but also happens to be the dissertation, or was, Asminkin's dissertation advisor, right? Asminkin wrote on Prigov with Galinka's supervision. All of this makes it much easier for us to work. First of all, they're poet scholars. It doesn't make sense to frame them as uninformed poets. And then in lots and lots of ways, they're our equals, right? In a way that really before '89, was just not possible. At the same time, they have no money. That's the big difference. No, it's true. That's the big difference.
So yeah, this is what I was alluding to about the practicalities of our practices and choices, and why I crudely said what we can do is pay them. Because absolutely, we can find ways of sharing resources and imaginative ways of navigating the institutions that some of us find ourselves lucky to be in by strange accident of fate.
And for somebody like Rambur right now, it's pretty much an emergency,
right?
Because of passport.
Right, exactly.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Marijeta. We, I think, come out of this much more learned than we were before, so really thank you.